Vi får det.
Evo dolazi. Što bježiš?
Pa neću bježati, lutko.
Šta si rekla, da ne vičem jebi ga, jel? Jebi ga.
Hello again. I'm back, and with a very special announcement. As you know, we have Bojan tonight with us here, the director of Museum of Forgotten Triumphs. And before I invite him over up to the stage, I'm going to tell you a little bit about him. Bojan Bodružić was born in Sarajevo, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and now resides in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. He holds a BFA in film production from Simon Fraser University and a joint MFA in film production and creative writing from the University of British Columbia. His short film Amnesiac was screened at festivals in Europe and North America, Palm Springs International Short Fest, Sarajevo Film Fest, Vancouver International Film Festival, and others. And his MFA thesis and debut feature, Immigrant, was screened at festivals in Canada and at the 2007 Canadian Front at MoMA. He teaches filmmaking at Langara College and University of British Columbia. Please welcome Bojan Bodružić. Welcome, Bojan.
Thank you.
Such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure being here.
And to have this film at our festival. I was just thinking now, watching it again, how heavy and funny this last scene was, especially for those who live outside. I think for many of us who left Bosnia or the region, so to say, these video letters were kind of a common thing. I think I have a few as well with my family. But I want to start somewhere, I guess, to ask you, you collected material over 15 years. When in this process did you know that there is a film here, and such a personal film? Because thank you, I think it's a brave thing to share your family history with the world. I don't know if I would be brave enough to actually show my family as well like that, but I know that these stories are so similar sometimes. Can you tell us a little bit about this process?
It really did start in 2000 when I was 20 years old and I went to Sarajevo for the first time. I hadn't been back in about 8 years. So in 1992, when the war started, my maternal grandmother, who passed away many years before, so she's not in this film, this is about my paternal grandparents, she took my sister and I out of the city, but my parents remained in Sarajevo. They were under siege. My mom managed to leave some months later, so we reconnected, but then my dad was in Sarajevo during most of the war. And so, but I'd been going, and then we came to Canada, I guess, end of '94. And after the war, my mom was the first one who went back. She was the one who did kind of that filming, the video letters and so on. And I didn't really get a chance to go back until 2000. So I left when I was 12, returned when I was 20. And at that time, I mean, when you're in film school, I think anybody who decides to go to film school is a bit cocky. You know, otherwise, why choose something so ridiculous? So you have to kind of believe in the impossible, like, oh, it'll work out for me. You know, chances. I teach filmmaking now, so I know you get like 20 students, maybe one will be making films, 20 years from now. And so I thought I would go and make a feature film. So at that time, I thought, yeah, I'm going to make this major film. And my grandfather is this kind of ambitious person. He did a lot more in his life than is even kind of apparent in the film. He was involved in so many different things. He was even kind of very engaged during the war. He was the president of a kind of municipal kind of government in Sarajevo, in aid of distribution of aid and all sorts of things. So when I went there, he wanted to put me in touch with all sorts of people in government and in religious institutions, and we're going to make a film about reconciliation in Bosnia and all sorts of things. So I was partly making my film, making his film, shooting all over the place, and I really had no kind of intellectual capacity or stamina or to really turn that into a feature film afterwards. I just collected material that kind of fed into a couple of short films that I made, and then I let the rest sit. And I really didn't know how this could be a film. It was difficult to know how this could be a feature film. And then over the years, I would go back every 2 or 3 years. I would film a little bit more. And then in 2011, my grandfather, it's as though he had some sort of an intuition that things might be coming to an end, started insisting that I go back and finish this film, that I really film their entire history and so on. So the bulk of the interviews you guys see in the film are from 2011. And then not a year later, the sad part of the film happens where my grandma passes away, and then 2 weeks later, my grandpa passes away as well. And then in 2015 is those last scenes and footage you see throughout the film of the sites, of their memories. That was all filmed in 2015. And after that, I sat on that footage, and I knew once that apartment was sold, once all of that kind of was closed, that I would have to make it into a film and finally kind of honor my grandfather in a sense, because he was, I would say in a way, I mean, they're both amazing, but he was really the one pushing for this film to be made and for me to kind of finish it. So I don't know if that answers your question. For many, many years, I really didn't think I'd be able to make this film. So it was something, yes, you collect this footage, you work on other projects, you return to it once in a while, you look at it, you maybe do a bit of editing, then you leave it. And it was initially supposed to be a much broader project about all sorts of things, about my life as well. But once I put myself on the periphery and decided, and even they had individual stories, their lives were complex. My grandfather's war stories were incredibly elaborate and involved. Once I decided it should be about the two of them and about the apartment, that's when I was able to start kind of eliminating footage, cutting away all that kind of excess stuff, and trying to find a kind of a linear narrative. Even though the film is non-linear, I tried to find something that would have some kind of a forward-moving momentum. Anyways, I'm talking too much, but yes.
No, you answered
maybe
my
that
other
answers
two
your next questions.
You
Yeah.
answered my other two questions. Fantastic.
Okay.
It's what's also very interesting, and you mentioned this, your grandfather pushed for this film to be made, and we see him almost in the film, almost co-directing, telling you, okay, you need to turn the camera this way, and you need to do this. And it's hilarious when the camera is in his hands, especially that black and white part where you're actually going back. And now I wanted you to explain it. So you'll go back to the house that is. So there is their apartment where they live, but there's this house which is in Derventa, is it or no?
No.
So no, okay,
So
I didn't get that for it.
Derventa, we see in one of the episodes where my grandma is talking about the house where my dad was born. So it's a kind of color footage. That's where we go back to this hometown that they talk about. The black and white house is the house where I lived, where I grew up. So my dad and my uncle built this big house that was split into two levels, into 2 apartments. And not to get into kind of what happened in Bosnia, but we kind of had to leave that house. And we ended up going to my parents' place because of what was happening politically at the beginning of the war. And we kind of left it behind. And we only were able to reclaim it after the war, but it had been by that point completely demolished, robbed, stripped of everything inside. And so this is the episode where my grandfather takes me to the place where I grew up, to my old room, and that was really me seeing all of that stuff for the first time.
And he's filming this.
He's filming it, yeah.
And I thought, and the way he was filming, I was thinking about really a cinema verite or direct cinema, the way he
Well, there's a little bit of
shoots.
cheating. I mean, I shot some stuff, he shot some stuff. There's some intercutting, not to go behind the scenes now, but yeah, it's a little bit more complex. But yeah, he did a lot of filming there, yeah.
So when you started going back in 2000, you haven't been there for a while. How much time would you spend? Did you go every summer, or is this sort of over 2-3 years?
In 2000, I spent a lot of time there. In 2000, I was there for about 3-4 months. So I went there as soon as I finished my semester, which would have been sometime in April. I left there. I think it was end of April, early May, and I came back early September. That was the longest I ever spent. And Sarajevo in 2000, despite all the devastation, was kind of an amazing city. My grandfather was involved with the Social Democratic Party, so he kind of introduced me to the youth of that party, and I started kind of hanging out with them, and they were organizing all these picnics, and it felt as though there was this kind of energy in the city, that change was possible, Bosnia was going to kind of evolve and develop, and but I feel that was the last summer when things really were happening. And subsequently in 2002, 2005, and so on, I felt like more and more of that promise somehow ended up being kind of betrayed, or a lot of those people who were involved in those things were slowly giving up. It felt like everything they were trying to do would never really take off. So that was the longest I'd ever spent, and this, I think the time that was the most meaningful in terms of Sarajevo. And afterwards, I would go every 2 to 3 years. And then since really I finished filming the film, I haven't been back yet, I have to admit, which was in 2015. So it's probably time to go back.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that. I remember almost returning to Bosnia in 2004,
2004, yeah.
2005, because it seemed like things
Yeah.
were kind of looking better, and
Yeah,
it seemed like
yeah.
you're going to be on a better path.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunately,
Yeah.
what we've witnessed afterwards. But I wanted to know also, this kind of a process for a filmmaker, especially when it's such a personal film, there's a lot of discovery. I'm sure you also have discovered things about the family that you didn't know, or part of the stories that were never told, because you ended up spending really this time engaging and talking about these things. And I'm wondering how, in this relationship that you established, this new relationship that you established with your grandparents, how did your parents deal with this whole situation? And were they happy when you were deciding to actually put the film out? Were they like, boy, no, we don't want to show the family to the whole world? Was that...
No, that was never an issue. I mean, I think they knew how much all this meant to my grandfather, or my dad. I guess I would talk about my dad in this particular case. And he's into film as well, so I think he was a willing participant. He's the person who goes to Sarajevo in 2015 with me. It's not really clear in the film, but the person who's talking about the war and kind of not seeing his son for a while and dreaming of having these dreams, these premonitions, that's my dad. And so no, that was never an issue. A lot of the stories in the film are stories that have been in the family for years. Some new ones, of course, do come out. There were some new ones that did not make it into the cut. But overall, I would say there was never any kind of tension, if that's your question, no.
And I'm sure there's way more where that came from. Obviously, you have so much footage, and they're incredible to watch. At times, I was forgetting that I was watching a documentary. I was thinking it was like, these things are kind of choreographed. This is almost, because they're incredible. And your grandmother says at some point that, and we're a bit boring. And I'm thinking, like, no, you're not boring at all. You're very interesting and it's quite peculiar. They're really wonderful. I want to talk a little bit about, specifically from a perspective of someone who is filming this and then dealing with the editing. This is an incredible and challenging task to edit. When you have such an amount of footage, and you said you decided to do a nonlinear film, so it's not necessarily chronological in the way it works. How did you go about editing, really? And how many hours of footage did you actually have in the end?
I couldn't tell you that because I kind of organized the footage according to time periods, and then I would work on those individual parts. And it took, again, the editing took place over time, over a couple of years. And so I don't know how much footage I had, but the way it worked, I would work on individual scenes. So I would work on this scene and that scene. I would work on like the 2000 parts, 2011 parts. It really started for me simply. It started with the end. The end was the easiest to cut because I had the least amount of footage. So when my grandma passed away and my grandpa got sick, I didn't really film much at all. When you're watching a film, I think you probably get a sense that it's just a continuation of a story and it was probably filmed the way everything else was filmed, but it wasn't. I would pick up the camera maybe every couple of days and film for 5-6 minutes. And so what you see in the film is really what I filmed. There might have been a few other shots. I just had to choose the right times to film, if that makes sense. And so that was easy to cut. And then once I had that, I started looking back. I thought about how to start the film. And really, honestly, this is the crazy thing. The scene that the film kind of starts with, not the very beginning, but the 1997 material, this video letter, where my grandma addresses the camera, that was this key discovery. I completely came across that almost by chance. I found these old high 8 tapes that we had and started looking through some of those, and I found this scene that I'd completely forgotten about. Because before that, I was always wondering, how do I introduce this whole idea of this family, the separation, and so on? Do I do voiceover, titles? I don't want to do any of that. I didn't want to use any kind of conventional contextualizing devices. And then I discovered that scene. I discovered this little sort of letter, and that was it for me. Once I had that, everything slowly started falling into place. And then, you just edit scenes, and then, you have 50 scenes at some point. You write them out on index cards, color-coded index cards for different periods. You throw them on the floor, you shuffle them. Then you actually try to put them all in that sequence. The sequence doesn't work. You reshuffle them, you remove some, and then it becomes this kind of dialectic process where eventually something is kind of carved out of that process, and you have what you have, which seems, I think, fairly natural. It doesn't seem like it's very complicated, but for me to get there was a bit of a complicated process.
It really is, and there's so many elements in it. I mean, because there's obviously family history, but there's also history of a country. It's in many ways it's also a film about Yugoslavia in a sense, about the end of this country where your grandfather was quite an active actually member and recognized member of the party, and thinking about how to kind of intertwine this, I was thinking the whole time how challenging this must be. And in this, however, there's this other part, right? It's your departure. You're leaving, your parents left a little bit later, you left first.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that? And did you ever consider possibly pulling that into as, I don't know, first-person narrator, or in any way, was that ever a consideration? Because at some point, when I watched the film the first time, I did wonder more about you.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I did think about all of those things. I thought about my parents. My mom actually worked as an ER doctor in Sarajevo during the war, during the worst parts of the war, kind of in 1992 during all the bombings and stuff. And so you wonder about all these things. I thought about, yes, using voiceover, using title cards, which I'd used in some of my kind of very early short films. And so, but pretty quickly, I realized that I was, not pretty quickly, it took me a long time really, but when I really started editing this film such as it is now, when I was able to gain some momentum and kind of bring it to an end, it started with me deciding that all of that is going to go by the wayside, kind of what I mentioned earlier. Even scenes that were more focused on a particular grandparent as opposed to them together were carved away, and it became this kind of triptych between the grandparents and their space, and the relationship of those kind of three elements. Those were the kind of the three key components that I decided to really, for better or worse. But it was really the only way for me to kind of bring the film to an end, or somehow have all of these elements cohere into something. It could have been any number of other things, but I felt that it would have been too digressive, too wide, too broad, and I decided to hint at all of those things obliquely. I give my dad this scene where he talks about his experience in the war, which I think kind of hints at that, but beyond that, I think everything else is just kind of a shadow film, which is about me and my family or my parents, which at least that's kind of how I watch it, but I didn't really want to do more than that.
No, I think at the same time, I think you made the right choice actually to go with this. Just out of curiosity, because this totally reminded me, this one moment in the film reminded me of scenes that I would see when I go to visit my uncle. The camera kind of pans from left to right. There's somebody sitting in the living room, and there's just this guy on the floor, chilling.
Right.
Who was that?
That's my dad.
It was your dad.
Yeah.
Okay, because I didn't recognize.
That's his thing. He loves floors. You can often find him on a floor in his own house, in other people's houses.
It's one of those things. I go to my uncle and I'm walking in. I was like, "Where is he?" And he's like, "He's there." I'm like, "Oh, okay." So yeah, kind of. It's good for my back.
It's exactly. That's what my dad says. It's good for his back. Yeah.
I have other questions, but I want to open it up to the audience. I want to give everyone a chance also to ask some questions.
Thanks. Hi. Wonderful movie. Laughed,
Thank you.
cried, loved it. Your sister, she is so funny. Could you talk about how she felt about the film? Because I think, is she younger than you?
She's 3 years younger.
Yeah, so just like, I guess she was then 17 when she went back, or around then. So, or whenever she went back, how did she feel about the film? Because she, I'm interested to see her thoughts.
Oh, I don't think she cares too much about how she comes across in the film. She's an incredibly smart person, very opinionated, incredibly highly educated, with like a degree from Oxford, and so has no complexes. She's like, okay, you can do whatever you want. I think she found it a bit embarrassing that I choose the scenes that I did. What she thinks about the film is a bit complicated, because she's a very emotional person. She was incredibly attached to my grandparents. Out of everybody in my family, she spent the most time with them, because she spent quite a bit while she was at Oxford, she was doing a thesis about Bosnian civil society. So she was really living, she would live there for parts of the time. She really became immersed in that culture, and so she spent a lot of time with them, and being the kind of person that she is, very family-oriented, very emotional. It's very hard for her to like, I sat with this film for a long time. I kind of dealt with my grandparents' deaths through this process of watching the footage and living with them. It's really crazy, because there was that kind of shock of them passing away, but then this odd feeling of living with them day after day as I'm editing the scenes. My dad, who also had a tough time with their deaths, my sister who had a tough time with their deaths, they didn't have that process. So watching the film for them, I think was quite tough, for my sister especially. So I think she thinks it's an okay film. She's like, but I can't give you an opinion because for me it's just painful watching it, you know.
And there's a question here. In front.
Enjoy the film. Thank you for being here,
Thank
Bojan. Your grandfather relayed that he wishes that you never forget the soil of your youth, where you grew up for 12 years. Will you adhere to this? Do you think you'll go back and retire or live there another time?
I did a couple of interviews earlier today, just by chance somehow, and so this kind of question sort of comes up. Not maybe that exact question, but something like it, which is, I guess, a question that talks about, that addresses the idea of identity. You know, where do you belong? And so I live in Vancouver now, which is perhaps a bit like New York insofar as it's, well, not as much history, but it's a very transient city. Lots of money flowing through the city. It's always changing. Something's always being built and developed. And lots of sites of my memories from my childhood being in high school are gone. So you walk through the city and nothing reminds you of anything because it's not there anymore. And it's a city that makes it difficult for you to kind of belong to it, if that makes sense. So I live in Vancouver. I love the city. But I don't feel like I really belong to it. Likewise, if I go to Sarajevo, it's a city that you gradually kind of grow away or grow apart from, if that makes sense, simply because you don't have that daily connection, and your idea of the city stays there somewhere in 1992 while the city is this living organism. The city changes, the country's changing, the language itself is changing, whereas your language has remained there in the past. So this is a very interesting thing. You probably have this experience too, like the language in the diaspora is the language of when we departed. It's a kind of like something set in jade, you know, something that was preserved like a mosquito, you know, but everything else over there evolves, so you just belong nowhere really. So will I return? Who knows? I really have no idea what the future will bring. It might depend on my work. I am interested in making more films that are set in that region. And one thing if it leads to another, but I really cannot properly answer that question, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You just reminded me also of the situation, for example, with language in Quebec.
Yeah, exactly.
Where
yeah.
the French actually.
Yeah, it's like a few centuries old. You know, they're French, but it's amazing that it didn't evolve after all that time. Yeah.
Hello. Thank
Hi.
you so much for that movie. I found it very powerful, and I have to say, it made me cry more than once. That's how well it was made, obviously. And the reason why it made me cry, because it's like the family, your grandparents. They could be anybody's grandparents, or at least a lot of grandparents, and a lot of my relatives that I know. And I'm from Serbia, you're from Bosnia. So it made me think about the stupidity of the war and how we're really all the same people, but not anymore, obviously. So for me, there's that element as well. But I love how you captured the essence of your grandparents, how they kind of banter with each other and they interrupt each other, etc. I thought that was like the best part of the movie. Really beautifully done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There's one in the back over there.
That was an amazing film, and I learned so much about I'll use the term Yugoslav culture. I married someone from the former Yugoslavia. And these films help me so much more than reading any kind of book I can find on what goes on. When I see a film about your family, I know it's a personal documentary for you, but it's a connection, it's a window into your culture for me. I heard mentioned that this concept of the video log, the video messaging was common during the period of the Balkan Wars. I'm just wondering, has there been any effort to collect these from the different groups among the region to try to compile some sort of documentary to give different perspectives of the story as it was happening from people, communicating with people back home?
Somebody should make that film, yeah. That sounds amazing. I'd watch that.
That would be great.
I don't know. I honestly don't know. I've seen some kind of from friends. Like the first time I actually saw Sarajevo, I think, during the war or after the war, was through one of these home videos that somebody had sent out of Sarajevo. Just like, I think, it was shot in '95, and I couldn't believe it. It was a devastating experience where you recognize the city, but you don't recognize it. It was completely surreal to me. So it's true, yeah, there was a lot of those kind of tape swaps and so on, but I imagine a lot of that stuff has probably kind of disappeared as you know, magnetic tapes, they decay. So unless you make a specific effort to preserve them, they're just gone.
Gotta get them soon. Sounds like a job for you.
Yeah.
There was an interesting project, but I don't know if you remember. I can't recall the name. It was by a Dutch group of artists who started it. I think it was late 90s when it was happening, where people were sending letters to each other, video letters to each other, friends, former friends, so to say, who were obviously divided by the conflict. Maybe we can talk afterwards. I'll try to recall. But that's an interesting sort of something like that, where the conversations were continued via these video letters.
Thank you. Great film.
Thanks.
Bojan, hvala mnogo. Thank you so much for a wonderful documentary. I was hoping you could give us a glimpse into what you might be working on next in terms of projects or films, and if it'll have more to do with the region.
I did just finish writing a script that takes place in Croatia and Bosnia, and so we'll see. It's about a group of people who kind of live all over the place, and they return for a little kind of get together. Well, I mean, it's kind of based around a funeral, and that's kind of how it starts. But it's a group of people who went to school together, survived the war together, but now they're all over the place, and they're all kind of at strange parts in their lives, and it's kind of early middle age, and everybody's sort of unsettled, and they don't know where to go from there, and stuff happens.
Now, I know there's a question, but now that you just mentioned that, I wanted to quickly interrupt. Thinking about this, also from what your grandfather says towards the end of the movie, do you feel a sense of responsibility when you were there and feeling like, well, I should be making films about this place, or I should contribute to this society, I should help this society move forward? Because this is something that I think a lot of us struggle very often.
The honest answer is that I did. Absolutely. Like when I was younger, I felt some kind of a need to do something meaningful, to contribute something. As you get older, not that disappears necessarily, but I don't know that I would call myself an artist or anything, but if you think of yourself as a kind of an artist, if there is a philosophy behind what I do, it's certainly not political or politically engaged on my part. I'm very deeply interested in just really my kind of own experience of people close to me. And then perhaps that reflects some broader issues, obviously. So when forces of history act upon you and upon your life, and then you make a film about your own life, of course, that's there. But I was never particularly interested in political engagement as such, if that makes sense. And I think over time, but I had friends who really were. Lots of friends who were involved in kind of politics or policy-related things, who lived in Bosnia. And so I would kind of obviously stay in touch with them, and then I see them kind of lose hope over time. So it's one of those things where I'm still interested, of course, about, like, I think looking at that society and issues in that society. But I don't see it as a responsibility anymore. Now it's just a question of curiosity. I'm still curious about what happens to people there, and people in the diaspora as well, particularly, who and their relationship to what's going on there. I don't know if that answers the question, but
Yes, it does, definitely. I mean, I was thinking about how you think about this. I mean, it's. I think we have a question over here.
First of all, congratulations.
Just a second, we have a mic.
Right.
Okay.
First of all, really congratulations from the bottom of my heart. It was very moving film, touching, of course, full of emotions. And I think the message that your grandpa said at the end of his life, actually whispering, but with the full power of his being, is the message that is needed to Bosnia. That's what still keep Bosnia all together. And I'm trying to resist from any comment, actually, since I'm a journalist, just to ask you a question. And my question is, since you mentioned that at the very beginning, that you have material left from this movie, do you feel that kind of obligation? Probably that was already answered with the questions, but do you feel that kind of obligations to contribute to the spirit of Sarajevo by continuing either doing another kind of feature movie or documentary or all, but specifically on Sarajevo, since you are from Sarajevo as well?
Before I answer your question, I enjoyed your performance. I saw the film that you were in during the opening.
I was not performing, by the way.
Or it was kind of a performance, no reading the text. And the Q&A that you guys did afterwards, it was wonderful, you and your team. So congrats on that film. I really enjoyed it. It's a complicated question for me. I really don't know that I can give a meaningful answer to that because it's something that you just kind of struggle with. You know, it's sort of part of your being, kind of the way you struggle with yourself. On the one hand, you want to do something. On the other hand, you feel like it's hopeless. And then you have this dialogue with yourself continually. The one thing that was amazing about my grandfather, unlike, say, my father, who I think is a lot more cynical, who I think was somebody who really believed in Bosnia as an idea and still does, but I think you just, when you get beaten by history so much and by all these kind of forces, and you feel like you're completely, you just want to basically abandon it. And so I think my father felt a great sense of relief coming to Canada because he felt he was away from it. But then pretty soon afterwards, he started reading all these press from like the entire region, from all, especially this kind of, how can I put it, this kind of press of resistance, so from Bosnia and Serbia and Croatia, and constantly being upset about something. And I said, well, just stop reading it, I mean, if you're not doing anything. And then he would submit, what he would do is he would donate money to these journalists. I remember there's kind of this independent press in Belgrade by, what's his name, Petar Lukovic. Yeah. I remember him donating to him, him and all, like those guys were getting screwed everywhere. So I remember, yeah, I mean, he really did do that. That was, I guess, his contribution. But my grandfather, unlike my dad and myself, his commitment to this idea was unwavering. And I think it was part of his personality. And I think it was something that was, in a way, how can I put this, carved out of him, or something that was solidified while he was really fighting during World War II. When he was only about, I think he just turned 17 before he kind of ran off and joined the partisans, because he came from this predominantly fascist area, and one of his uncles was an Ustaša, this kind of Croatian fascist, and something in him. He talks about this actually in the footage, which is not in the film, because I just, there was so much, some things had to go. He talks about how he decided to join the partisans, which actually really had to do with his own kind of education. After 12, he couldn't go to school, but he kept reading the Russian greats, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, and reading newspapers. And at one point he said, well, this is not okay, what's going on in this place, and then he just kind of took off. And he was a person with this enormous amount of conviction that carried on in his political engagement during the war and after the war to the very end. He was kind of committed to his SDP, Social Democratic Party, and that party had tons of issues, but he felt, well, we'll get it on the right path, we'll find a way, and so. He was a true believer, yeah, absolutely. There was something about him that blows my mind to this day. Somebody, the most, how can I put this, optimistic person, one of the most optimistic, him and actually some of his friends who I'd met, who also these kind of like old kind of guard from Sarajevo, they were among the most optimistic people I'd ever met in that city. Nobody after that generation. My parents' generation was a lot more disillusioned. My generation, perhaps even more so. But something about them, those old folk who stayed behind, they really still did believe. So I find it very interesting.
I think that's all the time we have.
Thanks for coming out.
Thank you, Bojan. Thank you, everyone.